The charger had only been on the side of the house for 72 hours when the first complaint was filed. It wasn't surprising, really. The device was sleek, quiet, and barely noticeable, but nothing in the neighborhood escaped the attention of the woman who lived 3 houses down. She monitored the street like a human surveillance system, tracking package deliveries, lawn heights, parking angles, and now apparently the existence of an electric vehicle charger. For years, her vigilance had been tolerated as an annoying quirk. But when she decided that the new charger represented a threat to the order she believed the neighborhood should maintain, everything began spiraling in a direction no one expected. From the beginning, the homeowner had planned the installation carefully. The charger met every electrical requirement, was installed by a licensed contractor, and adhered to both city regulations and the HOA guidelines, or at least the guidelines that actually had legal authority. The HOA binder, thick enough to stop a small caliber bullet, made no mention of EV chargers at all. And that silence was precisely what made the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer find it intolerable. Silence meant inconsistency, and inconsistency, in her mind, meant chaos. The first letter arrived on a dull Wednesday morning. It had been slipped into the mailbox, folded with the crisp precision of someone who took pride in passive-aggressive correspondence. The accusation inside claimed that the charger was a hazard, an eyesore, and a violation of community aesthetic harmony. There was no official HOA letterhead, no signature, just a template clearly generated by someone who had used the same format many times before. While the homeowner discarded it without much thought, the letter marked the beginning of something far larger than a neighborhood annoyance. Over the next week, the woman escalated. She approached board members with the matter, insisting the charger created an electrical risk. She cornered neighbors, warning them that the device would cause property values to drop. She fixated on the thin cable, claiming it looked like something from an industrial site. Her arguments grew increasingly dramatic until she finally pushed the HOA into sending an official notice requesting clarification and review. It wasn't a violation, merely a request, but she treated it as a victory. The HOA president, an exhausted man who had long ago stopped caring about minor disputes, reluctantly agreed to schedule a review, even though he admitted it was mostly to quiet the complaints. But once the woman sensed that she'd achieved recognition, her confidence blossomed into full crusade. She began photographing the charger at different angles, as though compiling a case file. She stood across the street, arms crossed, taking notes. She called the utility company and made claims about power surges. She even attempted to measure the distance between the charger and the property line using a bright yellow tape measure she carried around like a badge of authority. Her behavior quickly became a spectacle. Neighbors whispered about her intensity, about how she seemed determined to turn a small charging box into a matter of life and death. People passing by slowed down just to observe her as she conducted her unofficial inspections. Even the mailman learned to avoid eye contact in fear of being dragged into a conversation about electrical safety codes he knew nothing about. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained calm. There was no violation, no safety hazard, no reason to worry. But as the complaints continued, something unexpected happened. One of the city's sustainability department workers, who routinely reviewed neighborhood complaints involving infrastructure, noted that the neighborhood had far fewer EV chargers than average. The city had been quietly pushing an initiative to encourage electric vehicle adoption, offering grants to homeowners willing to install public-use chargers or additional units. Most people ignored the program, but a complaint drawing attention to a new charger triggered the city's interest. 2 weeks after the first letter, a polite email arrived from the city. It explained that they had received public concern about an EV charger installation and wished to verify compliance. The inspection, conducted by a city engineer, took less than 10 minutes. Everything was in perfect order. There was no hazard, no code violation, no aesthetic issue recognized under city ordinances. The engineer even commented that the installation was cleaner than most he'd seen. But what truly shifted the course of events was what happened after the inspection. The engineer forwarded information about the sustainability grant program, noting that the city was looking for homeowners willing to add more chargers to underserved areas. The program paid nearly all the installation costs and even included a small stipend for anyone willingly making their charger accessible to neighbors with EVs. It was meant to promote community adoption and reduce grid strain by spreading out charging locations. The irony was almost cinematic. The very complaint intended to eliminate the charger had instead positioned the homeowner as an ideal candidate to install more. Meanwhile, the woman who sparked everything continued her crusade completely unaware of the city's interest. Believing she had momentum, she escalated her tactics. She began submitting near-daily complaints. Claims of humming noises that didn't exist, accusations that the charger emitted dangerous radiation, warnings that the cable presented a tripping hazard despite being neatly mounted. Her language became increasingly frantic, invoking words like emergency, liability, and mandatory removal. The HOA board groaned collectively at every email. Still, the rules required them to investigate complaints, even ridiculous ones. They performed another inspection, once again finding nothing wrong. Their patience was wearing thin, but hers seemed endless. As the tension grew, so did curiosity from neighbors. Some started quietly observing the situation, wondering how far she would go. Others found amusement in the absurdity, making light jokes about dangerous chargers and electrical doom. But beneath the humor was a shared discomfort. Neighborhood conflict had a way of growing roots, and once roots dug in, they twisted through every interaction. Friendly waves became cautious nods. Conversations grew shorter. People stayed indoors just a little longer to avoid crossing paths. Still, the homeowner maintained composure, choosing not to engage. There was no reason to inflame things. The city's email had provided a strange sense of satisfaction that outweighed the annoyance of the complaints. The situation no longer felt like harassment. It felt like a curiosity, a strangely unfolding event that might lead somewhere unexpected. And then, at the end of the third week, the city sent a second message. It stated that the homeowner had been selected as a candidate for the sustainability grant, and that, pending approval, they could receive full funding to install up to 2 additional chargers. The program's coordinator even thanked them indirectly for contributing to the city's environmental goals. The homeowner stared at the message for a long moment, realizing that the situation had reached a turning point. The next chapter of the strange story was about to begin, and the neighborhood had no idea what was coming. The woman who had started everything was still intensifying her efforts, still confident she was winning, still unaware that the city's decision was about to ignite a reaction unlike anything the neighborhood had witnessed before. The city's approval arrived in an official digital envelope, marked with sustainability logos and municipal seals that made the entire matter feel unexpectedly grand. The homeowner read the message 3 times, absorbing every line of it. The grant wasn't just a small reimbursement. It covered significant installation costs, offered a credit for making one charger semi-public, and even provided a modest incentive for participating in a pilot program designed to track EV usage patterns in suburban areas. It was the sort of opportunity that seemed almost unreal. And yet, it had been triggered by the very complaints intended to eliminate the original charger. Before anything could move forward, the homeowner needed to confirm acceptance. They responded immediately, and within 48 hours, the city scheduled a consultation to determine the placement of the additional chargers. It was meant to be a simple meeting, involving just the homeowner and 2 program coordinators. What no one anticipated was that the woman down the street would be watching. By that time, she had grown increasingly vigilant, convinced that something suspicious was happening. She noticed the city vehicle parked outside the home and began pacing on the sidewalk, peering from behind hedges, tracking every movement with growing agitation. Her fixation had reached a point where neighbors quietly commented that she seemed to be outside more often than inside, as though monitoring the situation had become her full-time job. The city coordinators ignored her presence, focusing instead on evaluating the property for optimal charger placement. They examined the driveway, inspected the garage's electrical panel, and discussed options for a unit that would be accessible from a shared street corner. Every step of the process increased her tension. She scribbled notes furiously, standing close enough to overhear but far enough to pretend she wasn't listening. Each time the coordinators gestured toward adding more equipment, her posture tightened, her expression sharpening into something between disbelief and horror. When they left, she rushed home, presumably to compose yet another complaint. The HOA received it less than an hour later. It accused the homeowner of hosting unregulated government activity, installing industrial-grade machinery, and endangering the neighborhood with increased electrical load. The message was frantic, lengthy, and littered with bolded words meant to convey urgency. The HOA barely responded, offering a curt note that any city involvement superseded HOA authority. The dismissal only fueled her frustration further. Meanwhile, word spread rapidly through the community. A few neighbors stopped by to ask what the city vehicle had been about. When they learned about the grant, their responses ranged from surprised congratulations to quiet amusement. Some even expressed interest in using the public charger, appreciating that it would give them an alternative to driving into the industrial district for charging. The neighborhood had entered a strange phase where curiosity mingled with tension, forming an atmosphere thick with anticipation. The installation date was set. Contractors arrived early in the morning, unloading equipment that made the project look larger than it truly was. Although the work was standard, the sight of workers in high-visibility vests and branded trucks gave the impression of a major infrastructure upgrade. It didn't take long for the woman to make an appearance, emerging from her house practically vibrating with distress. She stood on the edge of her property, arms folded, watching every movement with the intensity of someone witnessing an unfolding crime. She called the HOA. Then she called the city. Then she called the utility company. Each call produced almost identical results. The installation was legal, approved, and entirely within the homeowner's rights. Her voice, loud enough that many neighbors overheard pieces of the conversations, carried desperation. She insisted the neighborhood was under threat, that property values would plummet, that stray electrical discharge would endanger children. Her claims grew increasingly dramatic until they crossed into the surreal. But regardless of what she said, the work continued. As the first charger was mounted, neighbors gathered discreetly, drawn by curiosity. The spectacle had the energy of a neighborhood event, silent, cautious, but undeniably communal. Some watched from driveways, others from windows. A few even filmed short clips, not out of malice, but because the situation had evolved into something sensational. Every hammer strike, every drill sound, every moment the contractors installed another component felt like an escalation in a drama they had unintentionally become part of. She paced relentlessly, making frantic gestures, attempting to get someone, anyone, to intervene. The contractors ignored her. The homeowner remained indoors. The HOA refused to engage. She was left helpless, and the helplessness fermented into something dangerous. A meltdown forming slowly, pressure building beneath the surface like a storm cloud growing darker by the minute. When the second charger was installed, her frustration reached a visible breaking point. She stomped down the sidewalk, muttering furiously, waving her arms in disbelief. She documented everything with her phone, taking rapid, shaky videos and narrating what she believed was an infrastructure catastrophe. The content was incoherent, but her determination to document every moment was undeniable. By noon, the contractors finished the heavy work and moved on to testing the system. The homeowner stepped outside briefly to speak with the city coordinator about the final inspection date. The woman's eyes locked onto them with a look of pure accusation. She stood frozen for a moment, then spun around and stormed back home, slamming her door hard enough for the sound to echo down the street. That afternoon, she submitted the longest complaint yet. It spanned multiple pages, filled with frantic claims and desperate demands. She accused the homeowner of colluding with city officials, of receiving special treatment, of violating the spirit of the community. She claimed the chargers would overload the grid, attract loiterers, and lower safety standards. The language bordered on unhinged, and when the HOA board reviewed it during an emergency virtual meeting, several members expressed genuine concern, not for the chargers, but for her. The board's response was firm. They informed her that the HOA had no authority to override city-approved installations and warned her that excessive complaints without evidence could be considered harassment. It was the first time anyone had put limits on her behavior, and the reprimand left her stunned. The neighborhood sensed the shift. People began to talk openly, no longer whispering. They commented on the absurdity of the situation, on the irony of the chargers multiplying instead of disappearing. Some took quiet satisfaction in the reversal of her efforts. Others expressed sympathy for her unraveling, though from a cautious distance. But as evening approached, the homeowner realized something important. The story wasn't finished. Her anger hadn't diminished, it had merely transformed. What had started as a campaign against a single charger had evolved into a personal crusade, and crusades rarely ended quietly. The neighborhood wasn't just dealing with a complainer anymore. They were watching someone lose control of the very order she'd spent years trying to enforce. And when order collapses for someone like her, the aftermath becomes unpredictable. The next chapter would decide just how far she was willing to go, and how dramatically the situation would unravel. The neighborhood woke the next morning to a strange, uneasy silence, the kind that settles only after a storm has gathered strength but not yet broken. The chargers gleamed quietly in the soft morning light, motionless, unassuming, unaware of the chaos they had inspired. The homeowner stepped outside briefly, expecting the usual bustle of early joggers, dog walkers, and commuters. Instead, the street felt unusually still, as though everyone was watching from behind curtains, waiting for the next development in the drama that had consumed their once quiet community. The woman down the street did not appear at her usual hour. Normally, she patrolled the sidewalk by dawn, clipboard in hand, scanning for violations. Her absence was unsettling, not because anyone missed her vigilance, but because it meant she was planning something. Her silence was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of strategy. By mid-morning, that silence shattered, she emerged from her house with a determined stride, carrying a stack of printed papers thick enough to resemble a legal dossier. The expression on her face suggested someone who believed she was on the verge of delivering justice, even if no one else understood what that justice entailed. She marched toward the HOA president's home, leaving a trail of muttered grievances in her wake. When she reached the house, she deposited the stack on the porch as though serving a lawsuit, then pivoted sharply and stalked away without waiting for anyone to come to the door. Moments later, she repeated the action at the homes of 2 other board members. The spectacle drew the attention of several neighbors who had already positioned themselves at windows to observe. Her behavior, bold and theatrical, had become a source of fascination. Some filmed from a distance, others whispered updates through group chats. The tension in the air was turning into entertainment, though tinged with discomfort. The documents contained everything from new accusations to grievances that stretched back years. Complaints about holiday lights, trash bins left out too long, grass that grew half an inch higher than she believed acceptable. But the bulk of the pages focused on the chargers. She claimed they represented a catastrophic threat, citing pseudoscientific articles, online conspiracy theories, and misinterpreted electrical charts she had printed from anonymous forums. Her demands were extreme, unrealistic, and impossible to enforce. The HOA president read through the papers with a sinking sense of inevitability. He knew the situation had moved beyond simple conflict. The woman's fixation had become all-consuming. She had crossed a threshold from concern into obsession, and the neighborhood was now living inside the fallout. He contacted the other board members and arranged a private discussion. Their conclusion was reluctant but unanimous. They needed to involve city authorities, not to assess the chargers, but to report escalating harassment and potential instability. They felt the neighborhood was no longer dealing with a rule enforcer. They were dealing with someone who might spiral even further if uninterrupted. While the HOA deliberated, the city's sustainability team scheduled a follow-up visit to finalize documentation for the grant. When another official vehicle arrived, the woman witnessed it from her living room window. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She rushed outside, waving her arms wildly, shouting accusations that could be heard half a block away. She followed the city workers down the sidewalk, demanding explanations, insisting they reveal who approved the installations, and claiming she had evidence of misconduct. The city workers, confused but professional, attempted to maintain distance. They explained that the visit was routine and that all procedures had been followed correctly. Their calmness only seemed to fuel her anger. She accused them of corruption, claimed they were part of a green energy conspiracy, and insisted the chargers were going to explode. Her words tumbled over themselves, each claim more dramatic than the last. Neighbors gathered again, drawn by the escalating scene. Some stood on porches, pretending to check mail or water plants. Others remained half-hidden behind blinds. The unfolding meltdown had become impossible to ignore. Parents quietly pulled children indoors. Elderly residents shook their heads with quiet disapproval. Even the occasional passerby slowed, sensing something unusual. The climax came when she stepped onto the homeowner's property line, pacing aggressively, pointing at the chargers as though presenting evidence to an invisible jury. She refused to move when asked by officials, insisting she had the right to inspect public hazards. Her voice grew hoarse, her gestures erratic. At last, the city workers contacted local authorities, not to escalate, but to prevent the situation from worsening. When the police arrived, they approached with caution, understanding they weren't dealing with criminal activity but with emotional volatility. They spoke to her calmly. They reassured her. They asked her to step back. But she continued to rant, convinced that she alone was protecting the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained at a distance, observing in stunned silence. They had never sought confrontation, never intended to provoke anyone. Yet here they stood, witnessing a complete unraveling caused by nothing more than a household upgrade. Eventually, officers persuaded her to return home. She did so reluctantly, muttering threats of appeals, petitions, and lawsuits. She slammed her door with enough force to make several neighbors flinch. Inside, she appeared to retreat into silence once more. The neighborhood exhaled as over the next few days, the atmosphere began to shift. People felt lighter somehow, relieved that the confrontation had finally reached an unavoidable peak. The HOA issued a formal notice to the neighborhood, explaining that the chargers were fully approved, legally protected, and welcomed as part of the city's sustainability program. They also noted that false or excessive complaints would no longer be entertained. The message indirectly addressed the meltdown without naming her, but everyone understood its meaning. In the weeks that followed, something interesting happened. Neighbors began using the public charger regularly. Cars appeared throughout the day, quietly connecting, powering up, leaving again. People who had never spoken much before exchanged brief greetings while waiting for their vehicles to charge. A small sense of shared utility began to form, something modern, practical, and quietly communal. The homeowner found themselves at the center of unexpected goodwill. Residents thanked them for the convenience. Some dropped off small gifts. Others simply expressed appreciation for how calmly they had endured everything. The chargers, once a point of controversy, had become a symbol of progress. As for the woman down the street, she retreated into a kind of watchful quiet. She still paced occasionally, still monitored the sidewalk, but the fire behind her crusade had burned out. The HOA's firm stance, the city's involvement, and the neighborhood's unified reaction had created boundaries she could no longer cross. Her influence had faded, replaced by a quiet resignation. Weeks later, the homeowner received a final email from the city, congratulating them for being featured as a model participant in the sustainability pilot. Their home had become an example of successful community integration. The irony was impossible to ignore. A neighborhood dispute had transformed into something beneficial for everyone. Everyone except the one who tried hardest to stop it. On a calm Sunday evening, as the sun dipped below the roofs and the chargers hummed softly in the background, the homeowner reflected on the entire ordeal. What began as a simple home improvement had spiraled into chaos, confrontation, and ultimately, a strange kind of neighborhood unity. The chargers remained, strong and steady, a reminder that sometimes the thing someone fights hardest against becomes the very thing that reshapes a community for the better. The story, dramatic, absurd, and unexpectedly uplifting, had finally found its ending.